Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you here this morning. Many of you will know the Performing Arts Center of Los Angeles County, better known as the Music Center, one of the biggest presenters on the west coast of the United States, a venerable organization that for many years has been offering us the world's greatest symphony orchestras, ballet companies, opera companies, in those great temples of culture, the Mark Taper Forum, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and so on. And about 8 years ago, when we started working with them, people at the Music Center were starting to ask themselves, what's going on around these buildings? Because if you know them, they're built in downtown Los Angeles, in an area that's surrounded with plazas around these buildings there in downtown LA. And the plazas were curiously empty, unless people were either coming into a show or leaving it. And that whole area of downtown LA had a curiously expressionless and empty feel about it. So some staff members had an idea, and they decided one Wednesday evening to put out a dance floor. They rigged up some lights, they arranged the music, and they invited people to come and dance. Not to watch a dance performance, but to try out your moves with your friends, with colleagues, with strangers. And about 100 people showed up. So next week they did it again, and 250 people showed up. And they began to realize they could do this on most weeknights, not just on a Wednesday. And soon there were thousands of people coming down to the plazas to try out their moves every week. So they diversified into other art forms. They created story circles. They created a drumming circle. They created a Get Your Chops Back orchestra, where you could come and scrape the rust off an instrument that you used to play. They even created a massed flute choir, which as a reformed flute player, I can tell you is the worst noise in the world. And they called all these activities active arts. And soon there were tens of thousands of people every evening, now on the lunchtimes and at the weekends, coming to engage in these new ways in the plazas around the Music Center in downtown LA. In fact, so many people were coming that people started to say, I might not get on the dance floor, I might not get into the band next week. So they introduced registration fees. They began at $5, now they're around $35 to $40, and still the numbers are climbing. So what was once a small experiment on a Wednesday evening has become now a major new revenue stream for the Music Center. And hundreds of thousands of people are getting to know the Music Center in this new way. None of them may ever buy a ticket to go inside those buildings, but it has fundamentally altered the civic footprint of the Music Center. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are now for the Music Center, who identify with it, who previously had no connection with it. So the question that I've been wrestling with these past 10 years, and which our work at EMCARTS is all based on, is what's going on here? Why is it that a large, well-established organization is doing something different, doing something it's never done before? And small and medium-sized organizations whose stories I could tell are doing the same kind of thing, and doing things which in many cases are really countercultural to what they're known for and known to be good at. And the answer, I think, lies in the changing world in which we're all having to operate these days. We're used to the idea of hierarchies, the control and order that comes from putting out our product in an organized way. But now we're living in a much more ambiguous world of networks. The future lies in networks, not in organizations, we're told. But we're used to the idea of a hub and spoke, of putting our messages out and having people communicate back to us. But now conversation is becoming much more distributed. There is no central leadership. We're into an era of movements. We're used to the idea of heroic leaders who will carry the vision and make all those big decisions and will follow along behind. But now the problems are so wicked, they tell us, that no single individual, no matter how brilliant, can solve these challenges on his or her own. So we need adaptive leaders, leaders who will be collaborative hosts to bring us together to address these challenges. I didn't have a picture of a servant leader, so here's a photograph of a guy inside a washing machine. But at least it's not Samsung. Adaptive leaders who can bring people together and reach out across difference to help try and address the complex challenges we now face in this much more volatile and ambiguous, uncertain world. I think for our sector, what that means is that we've been focusing for a long time on this idea of stability. As organizations have grown in our sector, we've kept them alive and propped them up with these heroic leaders, with strategic plans that are rational in nature and expect the future to look like the past, only more so. And we've underpinned it with capitalization based on endowments and on building buildings. But I think in the last 10 years, we've come to understand that there's a whole other dimension to the capacities that our organizations need if they're going to thrive in the future. I call it adaptability, and it's a different set of qualities. those adaptive leaders who bring people together and facilitate addressing complex challenges. It's requiring us to become more spontaneous, to move away towards increasing the way we plan for the future by incubating innovations on a consistent basis, and bringing onto our balance sheets what I call innovation capital, a new kind of capital for our field, where we have funds on our balance sheets that we can then apply to support our innovations when the time is right. Now, I'm not suggesting here that everything on the top left there is wrong and everything down on the bottom right is correct. What I'm suggesting is that in our field, every organization, the organization you work for, and our whole field, has got to find a new balance between these two sets of capacities if, in fact, the trajectory of our public value and impact is going to continue to rise. This means, I think, that the structure of our field is changing. And the future, I think, will be structured for what I call resilience. What I mean by that is biological resilience, where organisms take on new forms and thrive in those forms without trying to snap back to the old ways. And this is already causing a lot of change in our field. At least 4 things, I think, are significantly changing. We're no longer the only theatre company in town. Now there are 7. There are 3 contemporary art galleries, and there are all kinds of other organizations competing for people's time and for their attention. So we work in much more complex systems, in which we cannot just drive our strategy from A to B to C to D, because there are too many interdependencies and unexpected consequences that come out of every action we take. We need to recognize, if we're going to navigate that kind of complexity, the level of creative interest and potential in our communities. We live in perhaps a more creative time than ever, and yet our organizations have in many ways restricted ourselves to just a small part of the expressive lives in our communities. To achieve this, we need much more open and nimble structures, capable of collaborating to create the kind of civic footprint, the kind of critical mass that we need now, instead of competing with each other to show how different we are from each other. Sam Jones, who works for the think tank Demos in London, wrote a while ago that the role of the cultural professional is changing from a model of provision to one of enabling. And what I think he means by that is that instead of it being our job to put out high-quality product to essentially passive consumers, our mandate now is to build and enrich the expressive lives of the citizens in our communities. This is a very different mandate that leads to a different underlying value proposition. I call it abundance and intimacy. And this means, therefore, the changes in our field are not just about an outreach program here or an online engagement program there. It's about the fundamental nature and structure of the organizations that are going to thrive in the future. And dealing with complexity requires of us that we have a very different response. When we're trying to get from where we are now to our vision of the future, we'd like it to look like this. In this kind of stepwise way, we move from where we are with inputs and outputs and activities towards the impact and realize the vision of the future. This is a classic logic model, if you will, a theory of change. We've all had to produce them for our funders over the years. But when it comes to dealing with complexity, with the conditions that I think we live in these days, it turns out to look rather more like this. And this is not, I think, because we've all been there, because life has suddenly become random, but it's because that unpredictable future in complexity no longer conforms to any rational or linear trajectory of getting from where we are now to where we want to be. So instead of planning our way into that future, which would be fruitless, we have to learn to experiment in the short term, to learn rapidly, and to discover the best way forward over time. The trouble with this is it can leave us feeling like there's nowhere to go, no pathway we can take, everything seems to be blocked off, or we thought we knew the rules of the game. But even from the first shot, we don't know what's going to happen. And this, I find, can leave our organizations bewildered and often paralyzed. What happens is we say, let's deal with the less complex issues. Let's do that technical fix that we know we can do, tuning up our current strategies, and we'll leave that really deep, complex challenge till next year or the one after. The problem is if we leave these complex challenges, they just get worse. And it gets harder to deal with them the longer we neglect them. So how do we move organizations forward out of this kind of condition of paralysis or complexity or just deferring to the complicated? And I think the most important and first thing we do is we have to question our fundamental assumptions about our businesses and the way we operate. Edgar Schein reminds us that every organization as it grows develops a set of underlying assumptions. They begin as reliable predictors of success. You try something, if it works, it gradually becomes part of the way you do business. So that what was once a questionable hypothesis about how you should proceed becomes a reality that's taken for granted by everybody in the organization. This could be about the repertoire we perform. It could be about the way we price the house. It could be about the way we communicate with our patrons, and many, many other aspects of our business. And as these assumptions grow, they fall down into the bedrock of our organizations and in many ways fall out of sight, becoming not only undiscussed, but frequently undiscussable. Now, this is fine, as long as the world stays as it was, because it means we can turn up for work and we don't have to go back to first premises all the time. There are things we know will predict success. Unfortunately, the world has a pesky habit of changing, particularly rapidly these days, and this is why these assumptions tend to live on beyond their sell-by dates, because we don't address them early enough. But the kicker is, as Ed Shine says, if you want to innovate as an organization and adapt, you have to resurrect, examine, and break the frame created by old assumptions. His language is strong. This is difficult work, even violent work in some ways. But for us, it's the roots of innovation. If you cannot change your mindset and your assumptions and stand on new territory before you start designing how you'll move forward, what will happen is that all your new ventures will gradually tend back to just being minor tweaks on business as usual. And it's this questioning of assumptions that led us to our definition of innovation when we started this work 10 years ago. We see innovation not as a product, but as a process of organizational change with these three particular components. That shift in underlying assumptions that I mentioned, but also a discontinuity from what you have been doing. This is not just an extension of business as usual. This is what we often call the next illogical step. And it's a step that suggests a genuine new pathway to creating public value and impact. This definition, I think, also helps us distinguish innovation from creativity. Janice gave that definition earlier, and I would say yes, creativity is a quality of individuals. Some people are just remarkably good at coming up with original ideas, and you need creative thinkers on your team if you're going to innovate. But innovation is turning creative ideas into feasible strategies that organizations can actually implement. So it's group work. It's work we do together that requires many, many different skills. And the good news, therefore, is that every organization can do this. Every organization can learn how to innovate as an organizational process. And even more, innovation can be systematized. We learned this particularly through a report that the Kellogg Foundation did a few years ago, the first in the nonprofit sector on innovation, where they concluded that nonprofit organizations should embrace innovation as a permanent part of our core competencies. Not something that we just do from time to time, but part of who we are, part of the way we engage with the world, saying that innovation is actually an organizational process with its own set of practices and procedures and tools. So all our work has been to try to take this understanding of what's changing in our world and turn it into frameworks and programs that we've now implemented all across the United States and increasingly here in Canada to help organizations with the adaptive work that we are now called upon to do. And from that, I think we've arrived at 5 principles that I'd like to end with as to how you can build a culture of innovation in your organization. The first, I think, is to indeed question assumptions early on. Don't wait until the crisis arrives. Don't wait until the numbers are going down before you stand back and question the basis of what you do and who you are. It's really important to do that early on. I often say, if it ain't broke, fix it. The second thing is to recognize that you can't plan your way out of complexity. You cannot create any kind of traditional strategic plan. You have to become more spontaneous, be capable of incubating innovations by conducting what we call small experiments with radical intent. A lot of people think that innovation is betting the house on an untested idea. We couldn't disagree more. We think it's about having the courage and the design chops to be able to create small experiments that are like pre-echoes of that vision you want to move to, but which don't cost you a fortune and don't take a lot of time, and then learn from those and build it up to prototypes over time. Jerry Sternin, who was the originator of the positive deviance movement, used to say, it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. Thirdly, understand that you need to embrace conflict. There will be conflicts in doing this work, conflicts of ideas, and they're really generative. It's really important to have idea conflict. As you peel off the layers, reject the first good idea, reject the second good idea. Keep peeling off the layers to come down to those truly original ways forward that will serve you well in the future. But don't let that idea conflict descend into personality conflict. And recognize that there will be paradoxes along the way that you have to grapple with. Niels Bohr, the great physicist, used to say, "At last we have arrived at a paradox. Now we perhaps may make some progress." The fourth thing, I think, is let's not fight ourselves within our organizations to do this work. The systems thinkers tell us that structure drives behavior, and you cannot maintain new ways of engaging with the world, internally or externally, on structures which were built for another purpose. So you have to restructure. You have to build new capacity that will specifically support your attempts to adapt and not get in the way over time and always pull you back. And finally, let's remember that if we're not to condemn innovation to being only about an essentially unsustainable expansion of our work, we have to continually give things up. We have to stop doing things, reduce the scale of them to make space for innovation. Otherwise, we'll just expand, or our innovations will remain what I call dwarfen. They are dwarfish in scale, and they are orphaned from our organizational mainstream. They just trickle along 1% of the budget 5 years later. We have to make space to build these into our core business over time. And the final thing is really that, as Donella Meadows, the great radical system thinker, likes to say, power in systems derives less from pushing leverage points than it does from strategically, deeply, madly letting go. And I think if we can do these 5 things, we can begin to understand what was going on at the Music Center in Los Angeles. This was an organization that was able to stand back and question its assumptions about who it was. Was it just a presenter selling tickets to audiences, or could people engage in another way? It was able to begin with small experiments and build them over time. It made space for that by giving up other programs, and it built the capacity internally to carry that work forward. And I think this is work that all our organizations can do. This is the real work I think we're called upon to do in the next 20 years. If we don't embrace it, I think our organizations will continue to drift, our audiences will continue to get smaller and older, and the roles we play in our communities will become more and more niche. But if we can embrace it, I think this is a time when we may, for the first time, be able to live up to that often expressed mandate that we play a central role in the vitality of our communities and offer unique services that can create healthy, engaged communities. This, I think, is the real work we have to do. It's arduous, it can be difficult, it requires a lot of imagination, but it's also remarkably joyful, we've found, full of release as new opportunities present themselves and new ways of engaging and building bonds in our communities come into being that we could not possibly have imagined before. Our medium is art, so I wanted to end with just a very brief poem by the American poet Wendell Berry. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. Thank you very much.